Well, I'm going to get right into it, and we're going to pick up right where we left off. Let me know if that beat's too loud. And so let's dive right in here. So we're using Yeshua, the Jewish life of the Messiah. We're also using the harmony. And we're in this section right now about the rejection of the king, the trial and the death of the Messiah, the religious trial. Okay. So essentially, this has been the main structure of everything we've gone through with the book. The introductory material, the introduction of the king, the authentication of the king, the controversy over the king, the turning of the 12 by the king, the opposition to the king, the preparation of the disciples by the king, the official presentation of the king, the preparation for the death of the king, and the rejection of the king, the trial and the death of the Messiah. Okay? So we're diving right into, as I said, the religious trial. And essentially I can't remember if this is the one we're going to talk about: the arrest, the religious trial, the civil trial. I think we're picking up with the civil trial. The first trial before Pilate, the trial before Herod, the second trial before Pilate. Then we're going to talk about, I think in this one, about how Bar Jesus was sort of like a counterfeit substitute of Yeshua. I'll explain that when we get there. The mockery, the procession to Calvary, the crucifixion, the first 3 hours were the wrath of men from 9 a.m. to 12 noon, 15th Nisan, Friday, April 7th, AD 30, according to this. All right, so let's go ahead and go into slideshow mode. I'm not sure why it's not going. Oh, it's because it's on a different side. All right, hold on, guys. View animation slideshow. It's on the wrong monitor. Primary monitor. Now we go. All right. Turning your harmony to paragraph 156 and on your outline to page 18. Now we enter the last section, the ninth main division of his life, the rejection of the king, which involves both the trial followed by the death. And we began, and we're in the midst of dealing with the religious trial, which is 3 stages, and we completed the second stage of the trial. Now, while the second stage is going on in one part of the compound, elsewhere in the compound, we have the events of paragraph 156, the denial by Peter. The denial by Peter. Now again, when he first arrested, the apostles were scattered, but now 2 of them began to follow where Jesus was taken, but a bit from a distance. Now John's family and the family of the high priest is somehow a relationship. So John 18:15 says, now that the disciple was known unto the high priest, and because of a familiarity, and the servants of the high priest knew John, they let him into the compound. And in John 15:16, Peter was standing outside, and John used his influence to get Peter within the compound, inadvertently setting the stage for Peter's threefold denial, as was prophesied by Jesus during the last Passover supper. Now as he enters in, the maid and some others accuse Peter of being one of the disciples. At this point, he has his first denial in Matthew 7 that he denies. It's a simple denial. Nothing, I don't know why it says Matthew 7 there, but nothing more than a mere denial of knowing Jesus or being a disciple of Jesus. At the end of Mark's account, Mark 14:6-8, that's when the cock crowed the first time. There's 2 ways to take this. This is about a rooster crowing once, and then the second time later. There's also the word the cock crow is used as a watch in the night. There's the first, the second, the third, the fourth cock crowing, and most likely this is referring to not the real rooster, rather than a cock crowing of the night watch, and if so, it's now midnight. A bit later that evening, actually nighttime, moving into the morning, the second person identifies Peter, and Luke points out in Luke 22:59 that it was about an hour later. Once again, he's identified as being among the disciples of Jesus. He denies them a second time. Notice that in Matthew 26:72, and again he denies with an oath. This time, it was not a simple denial, but a denial with an oath. And when he denies Jesus the third time, he sets it even stronger. In Mark 14:71, for example, he began to curse and to swear. Now, the way the text reads in Greek, the swearing requires an object. What it actually means is to begin to curse and to curse Jesus himself. He went from a simple denial and now with an oath in which he probably used the name of God, and now he actually uses a curse. And in Matthew 14:72, that's when the cock crew the second time and makes it 3 o'clock in the morning. So in a 3-hour period, he denied Jesus 3 different times. And the third denial, that's when apparently the second stage of the trial came to an end. And Luke 22:61, at that point when Jesus turned the eyes of Peter and Jesus actually met, that's when Peter suddenly remembered the prophecy of Jesus, that before the second cock crowed, he was denying 3 times. And in Luke 22:62, that's when he went out of the compound weeping bitterly. The mocking and beating. Now go back to paragraph 155, because here again is A.T. Robinson broke Luke's order, and Luke's section of paragraph 155. Luke 26, 63, and 65 belong at this stage. What you have here is the third physical mistreatment. He suffers on the night, and also you have the first 8 of mockeries. He will suffer 4 mockeries before the cross, and he will suffer 4 mockeries on the cross. Here's the first of the 4 mockeries before the cross: the condemnation by the Sanhedrin. Paragraph 157, and this is the third stage of the trial, and the condemnation before the Sanhedrin. By this time, some may have come to their senses and realized all of this proceedings, segments of the trial, have been totally illegal. The only purpose of this third stage is to try to give a measure of legality to what was become totally illegal, and they wait for a measure of daylight. And all 3 Gospels account make this point. So Mark, let's see. So Mark 15:1, straightway in the morning. Matthew 27:1, when morning was come, and in Luke 22:66, as soon it was day. They wait for a measure of daylight and quickly reconvene. They ask Jesus 2 questions. The first question is Luke 22:67, if you're the Christ, if you are the Messiah, tell us. His answer in 37:69 is it's useless to tell them. They've already determined not to believe. But again, someday they'll know the truth of his claims when they see him seated at the right hand of God the Father. The second question is in this verse 70. Are you then the Son of God? His answer is yea, say that I am. The way the English reads it may appear to be what you're saying. That's not what I'm saying. But in Greek, there's a very emphatic way of saying, yes, indeed. That's exactly who I am. In American English, we have a similar way of saying this. Somebody makes a statement and we respond, you said it. You said it. When we say it that way with the tone of voice, we're not saying that's only your opinion. We're affirming the truth of what the person just said. That's the way the emphasis is here. When he said, you say that I am, it's an emphatic way of saying, yes, indeed, that's exactly who I am. You best recognize. So with the ending of the trial, the first stage, they officially condemn him to death in Matthew 20. Condemn somebody to death. What they could not do at this point in their history is actually carry the death sentence out, because the Roman Senate had taken away from the Jewish Sanhedrin the right to capital punishment. So if Jesus was to die, he will have to die based on Roman law, not based upon Jewish law, and that creates another problem, because while blasphemy was punishable by death under Jewish law, it was not punishable by death under Roman law, and therefore they have to change the issue in the civil trial. As I mentioned, Judas was not needed for the religious trial, but he'll be there for the civil trial to fulfill his third function, to serve as the prosecuting witness. What happened between the Jewish and Roman trial was Judas dies. In Matthew's account, Matthew 27:3, the Judas which betrayed him when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself. Because of the repent, here the question has arisen, was Jesus saved? After all, it says he repented. Now, I'm not weighing in on this right now, but just giving his view. When I was a new believer, I was in the foyer of a Baptist church in South New Jersey, and it was a large foyer. There was a large wall with a track rack. It had all kinds of tracts. One of the tracts and booklets in the foyer was this very question: was Jesus saved? I was only beginning my New Testament studies in those days, so I thought it'd be a good question to deal with, and I pulled it out to find out whether Judas was saved or not. I opened to the page and it says, was Jesus saved? Judas saved? That's not the question. The question is, are you saved? It went on to give me the gospel, which I already believed and never answered the question. That's called false advertising in Christian literature. Clickbait, right? Now, in Greek, there are two different words, both of which come out as repent in English. And the first Greek word in the word metanoia, which means repentance, is change of mind. You can change your mind about Jesus. In the Jewish context, here you have changed your mind about being possessed, demon possessed, and you believe he's the Messianic king. That's the word that normally is carried in the course, but there's no real salvation repentance. The answer is no, he was not saved, and as prophesied, he goes to perdition. Now, critics of the New Testament who deny inspiration point out two major discrepancies between Matthew's account and Luke's account in the Acts pages. They also point to a mistake about Matthew, whom he quotes. So let's deal with these. The first discrepancy they point out to is exactly how did Judas die. At the end of Matthew 27:5, it says, he went away and hanged himself. But Luke says in Acts 1:18, falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst, and all of his bones gushed out. In our English, he fell and his guts gushed out. So how did he die? Did he die by hanging, or did he die by falling with his guts gushing out? Now, from the perspective of Jewish law of that day, both statements are actually true. The principle is Jewish reckoning of time. Keep in mind the day does not begin at midnight, as in the Greek Gentile reckoning. It begins at midnight. So the Sabbath is not simply Saturday. Technically, the Sabbath is from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday. Now, Saturday night is Saturday, but it's not the Sabbath anymore. Saturday, technically, the Sabbath is from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday. Yeah, he already said that. Now, because of the system, the first night of something precedes the first day of something. The first night of Passover precedes the first day of Passover. And the first night of Passover is when the Jewish families would eat the Passover meal. And Jesus observed his last Passover on the first night of the Passover with the apostles. And the first day of Passover, which follows the first night at 9 in the morning, there would be a special Passover sacrifice. And for the sacrifice, only 25 men partake in the afternoon, the high priest and the 24 chief priests. However, by Jewish law, if there was a dead body within the walls of Jerusalem, the city was viewed as being unclean, and whenever the dead body was within the wall, they could not proceed with the Passover sacrifice. So to deal with the issue, the law went on to read that in order to be able to cleanse the city for the sacrifice, you take the dead body, you throw it over the wall of Jerusalem, the wall that faced the valley of Hinnom, and then once the body is thrown over the wall, then you can proceed with the sacrifice, and then the burial detail to go out and bury the body. Now, when Judas was filled with regrets and remorse, he tried to return the funds to the chief priests. He refused to take it. He simply dumped it in the temple compound and went away and hanged himself. He died by hanging. In order to maintain the city ability to perform the sacrifice at 9 a.m., his body had been thrown over the wall. In the fall, his guts gush out. So from the perspective of Jewish law of the day, both statements are true. The second discrepancy has to do with who purchased the field. Now, Matthew points out it was the chief priests in Matthew 27:6-10 that purchased the field. But Luke says in Acts 1:18, now this man, meaning Judas, obtained the field with the reward of the iniquity. So he bought the field, the chief priests and Judas. Here again, from the perspective of the Jewish law, both statements are true. Now, by Jewish law, money wrongfully gained cannot be put into the temple treasury. Again, from the viewpoint of Jewish law, money wrongfully gained cannot be put into the temple treasury. We see that the law reflected in Matthew 27:6. It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it's the price of blood. And by Jewish law, those who knew the money were wrongfully gained had to return the money to the donor. However, suppose the donor dies before the money can be returned to them, then what do? You still cannot put in the temple treasury, but then you have to use the money to purchase something for the public good. And that's what they do. They purchase something for the public good. They purchase a field to bury strangers in. However, the purchase had to be still in the name of the donor, though the donor was dead, and therefore the actual legal documents themselves would have the name of Judas in it. So by technical Jewish law, Judas purchased the field, and the chief priests that do this are strictly his purchasing agents. So again, from the perspective of Jewish law, both statements are true. Now the discrepancy, not between Acts and Matthew, but the violation of the discrepancy of quotation. We read in Matthew 27:8, wherefore the field was called the field of blood unto this day. And it was fulfilled which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet. And it goes on to quote not Jeremiah, but Zechariah. Now the last part of the quotation does come from Jeremiah. The first part comes from Zechariah. The second part comes from Jeremiah. So one way to respond to this is to point out why he doesn't mention both prophets, but he does quote a portion of Jeremiah. He just doesn't mention Zechariah. A second answer to the way to respond to this is sometimes when you're dealing with different scrolls, just by mentioning the first book of the scroll, it covers the whole scroll. So by mentioning Jeremiah, it covers the whole scroll of the prophet. So that would include Zechariah. The problem with this response is that if it's true, only if the first book of the scroll was mentioned, and the first book of that scroll would have been Isaiah, not Jeremiah. So if he said Isaiah, that would be a good way to respond it, but he doesn't say Isaiah. He says Jeremiah. Now let me give you a third response, which is my preferred response to this. Now notice only Matthew mentions this. Also remember, Matthew's the one that continues to trace the consequence of the partible sin in paragraph 61. And notice what the field was purchased, the field of Akadama. It was named that once the field was purchased. Now take your Bibles and turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 18, make it chapter 19, although it's first mentioned in chapter 15. Now there was a section just outside of Jerusalem known as Topheth. Let me illustrate this for you. So you got right here, you got the Kidron Valley. So this would be Nakah, Kidron, and then you have Tophet right here, which he's also saying is the field of blood, which is Kadal Dama. And then Hinnom Valley's over here, and this is Gi Hinnom. And here's the Temple Mount, and here's Golgotha. So I guess he's saying it happened here. All right. Here's a picture of the walls of Jerusalem as they were in the time of Jesus. You had the walls, the temple compound. Golgotha was just inside the wall on the left-hand side, on the west side, and surrounded all sides of the city, except with the north side were valleys on the west side of the valley, on the south side the valley of Hinnom, and in Hebrew, by way that's Gehinnom. It's Greek, it becomes Gehenna. Gehenna became the technical name for the lake of fire for reasons I'll explain in a few moments. On the east side of the valley was the second valley called the Kidron Valley that separates the old city from the Mount of Olives. And right where the two valleys meet is the Old Testament is called Tophet. And Tophet is where the practice human sacrifice. And because of the practice of human sacrifice, that's where Jeremiah pronounces a specific curse. And the curse in Jeremiah chapters 15, 18, and 19 is that day will come, that they will bury in Topheth until there's no longer any room to bury, especially Jeremiah 19. 10 to 13. And so Topheth became a place of the burning of humans. And that's how Gehenna became Gehenna, the eternal place of the burning of humans in the lake of fire. Here it talks about the physical burning of humans as they were offered up as sacrifice to certain idols and gods. But when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 586 BC, it did not fulfill the prophecy. This prophecy was fulfilled only in the events of AD 70. Where there were so many killed and so many corpses, so full of corpses, one historian in ancient times wrote, there simply was no longer room for burying. And the point that Matthew's trying to make is that when they purchased the field in Topheth, they purchased the curse of Jeremiah. And so in the year 70, when the judgment came for the unpardonable sin, they buried in Topheth. There was no more room for burying. It was given a new name, an Aramaic name, Akadama, meaning the field of blood. And so the use of Jeremiah's name is to emphasize Matthew against the one that traces the consequence of a pardonable sin, the continual burying and burning Topheth until there's no more room for burying, and they purchased a curse, which was finally fulfilled in AD 70. Right at the end of this event between the two trials, notice they no longer have the prosecuting witness anymore, and that's the reason why there was confusion in the first stages of the religious trial, but now there will also be confusion in the first stages of the civil trial. They don't have the prosecuting witness any further. Civil trial. In paragraph 159, 162, we have the civil trial. This undergoes 3 separate stages. As I mentioned, the civil trial has to change the issue because the issue will now be blasphemy, but it does not carry the death penalty. The issue here will be sedition or treason against Rome. Now, in the Jewish trial, I gave you 22 laws that were violated in the Jewish trial. Let me give you 2 Roman laws that will play a role in the trial. 2 specific Roman laws. Number 1, all proceedings have to be public, and this one is very public, much to Pilate's regret. The second law that is involved here is that the trial has to begin with a prosecuting witness. The trial began with a prosecuting witness presenting a charge punishable under Roman law. It's because of the second rule they have to have Judas present and given the charge, but they have no prosecuting witness anymore. The first trial before Pilate. Now in paragraph 159, we had the first stage, the first trial before Pilate. Pilate was a Roman citizen born in Spain. He served as procurator from the year 2636 AD. He was the longest ruling procurator in Judas history. This trial takes place at the midpoint of his procuratorship in the year AD 30. In contemporary Jewish writing, he's viewed as being noted for his cruelty, but normally a correct Roman following strict Roman procedure. And although it's the wee hours of the morning, he's dressed and ready to conduct the trial. He was anticipating the trial because earlier he had released a Roman cohort for Judas to make the arrest. I think that's supposed to say not for his cruelty. Now, John 18:28 says, they led Jesus before, therefore, Caiaphas into the place, or Praetorian, and it was early, and they themselves entered into the palace, and that they might not defile themselves, but might eat the Passover, and because the way it implies. Here the Passover has not yet been eaten. Some have suggested that Jesus ate his Passover meal a day early. But keep in mind, as far as the Mosaic law, he kept the law perfectly, down to every jot and tittle. The Mosaic law specified which night of the month the Passover must be eaten, and he would not have violated the principle. Now, in the context of John 18, the pronoun they goes back to the chief priests. He's not dealing with the Passover meal the first night of Passover, but for the Passover sacrifice of the first day of Passover, on which the high priest and 24 chief priests partake. But if anyone came unclean, they could not partake at the Passover feast, and that's why they go only so far and no further, so they may still partake at the Passover. And in keeping with the second Roman law, at the end of John 18:29, Pilate begins with the question, what accusation bring ye against this man? And Judas was supposed to step forward, but he's gone now. So in verse 30, they respond, if this man were not an evildoer, we should have not delivered him unto you. And at that point, they make it as they don't have a prosecuting witness anymore. They simply tried to pressure Pilate to merely pass a death sentence with no trial, no verdict, and no sentencing. At this point, Pilate, the correct Roman, will have none of it. So he says in John 28:31, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. If there is no accusation, there will be no trial. If there's no trial, there will be no condemnation. If there's no condemnation, there will be no sentencing either. And they respond, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death, meaning no longer lawful under Roman law. And notice John's editorial comment in John 28:32, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying what manner of death he should die. And Jesus said more than once, as we noted, that when he dies, he would die by crucifixion. Now, crucifixion was not the Jewish mode of execution. That was the Roman mode. The Jewish mode of execution was stoning to death. If Jesus died under Jewish law, he would have to have been stoned to death. But if he was stoned to death, he would be rendered a false prophet because he prophesied he died by crucifixion, not by stoning. Excuse me. And the timing, by the way, specifies exactly what year the Roman Senate took away from the Jewish Sanhedrin the right of capital punishment. It says it happened 40 years before the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed in year 70. Subtract 40 years, you have the year 30, the very year of this trial. In other words, if the trial had taken place only 6 months earlier, he would have been stoned to death and rendered a false prophet. But in the providence of God, the proper time, God moved the Roman Senate to take away the right of capital punishment from the Sanhedrin. And so now Jesus dies, he'll have to die under the Roman law, not under Jewish law. Now, when the leaders realized that Pilate would not proceed until he has a specific accusation, they finally produced one in Luke's account, Luke 23:2. They accused him of sedition, of treason, of 3 counts. First of all, perverting our nation, fomenting a revolt. Secondly, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, an act of rebellion. But third, claiming himself to be a king. And if he claims to be a king, he claims to be a competitor to Caesar. Now, this is a specific charge so they could continue with the Roman trial. And what follows the accusation is the questioning of the accused. So in John's account, the end of John 28:33, he asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Now, Pilate is not asking Jesus, are you the Messiah? From a Roman perspective, that's not where he's coming from. The point of his question is, are you really claiming to be a competitor to Caesar? At typical of Jewish response, he responds with a question of his own. In John 18:34, do you say this of yourself? Or did others tell you concerning me? Oh, what basis are you asking me this question? For the perspective of a Roman or the perspective of a Jew? Hey, William. And Pilate answers in John 18:35, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you unto me. What have you done? And Pilate says, I'm not a Jew. That's not where I'm coming from. You've been turned over to me by the Jewish chief priests with a specific accusation. So are you claiming to be the competitor to just Caesar? And once the question is clear, the issue is clear, he can answer in John 18:36. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then wouldn't my servants fight, and I should not be delivered unto the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence, or not from now. Simply put, no, I'm not a competitor to Caesar, and that for 2 reasons. First of all, my kingdom is not of this world. And this has become a very favorite proof text for those who are amillennial, those who don't believe in a future Messianic kingdom. They claim that when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world," shows his kingdom will not be in this world. But there's a difference between saying "of the world" and "in the world." It's not a play on semantics with them because it's the very same gospel. In the two preceding chapters, 16 and 17, he himself makes that distinction. Concerning himself and believers, he says, "We are in the world. We're not of the world." Now, to be of the world is to be of this world's nature, and the believers are no longer of this world's nature. As long as he's living, he's in the world, but no longer of it. The same thing applies here. His kingdom is not of this world's nature. He's not really coming back to the policies and to the policies that see the throne. He's coming with his own throne, the throne of David, with his own kingdom, the Messianic kingdom. So his kingdom will someday be in the world, but never of this world, never of this world's nature. The second reason he does not compare to the Caesars because his kingdom is not for now. As a result of rejection of the king, as a result of the unpardonable sin, as we saw in paragraph 61 and 64, his kingdom will not be set up at this stage of Jewish history. And in John 18:37, Pilate asks a quick question: "Are you a king then?" Meaning, are you a king in any sense of the term? And Jesus answered, "In one sense, I am. I am a king of the truth. And those who are the truth hear my voice." But this stage now comes to an end with a sarcastic question in John 18:38. What is truth? And what is so sad for Pilate is this: at this moment, he's looking at the truth and failed to recognize him where he stood. The result in Luke 23:4 is that he comes out and issues the first of several declarations of innocency. Insofar as Pilate is concerned, he's no threat to Rome. While following this first declaration of innocency in Mark 15:3, they begin to accuse him of many other things. And Jesus responds in Matthew 27:12 by saying nothing. And in Mark 15:4, when Pilate asked Jesus to respond, even then in verse 5, Jesus refused to respond. Now, as these accusations are being brought out on Luke's account, Luke 23:5, someone happens to mention that Jesus originated from Galilee, and the mention of his Galilean origins gives him a way out of his perspective. The situation, because while both Samaria and Judea are under this jurisdiction, Galilee was not under Pilate's jurisdiction. This was under the authority of Herod Antipas, who had come to Jerusalem to help maintain order during the festivals. So he chooses to send Jesus over to Herod Antipas, the trial before Herod. Paragraph 160, the second stage of the civil trial, is the trial before Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, the one that tried to kill Jesus when he was 2 years old in Bethlehem. Now this Herod is the Herod's son. Now this Antipas here is one about a year or so earlier had beheaded John the Baptist. Only after hearing about the beheading of John did he begin hearing about the miracles of Jesus. And he even sent for him once, and Jesus simply said, "Go and tell that fox no." But now he has his opportunity, and he wants to have Jesus perform these miracles for him. He wants to be entertained by these miracles, but Jesus responds with not answering any questions and giving no signs. And so Antipas simply reduces him to the second mockery he suffers on this night, but he uses a second declaration of innocency. As far as Antipas is concerned, he's no threat to Rome. Now Luke 23:12 says, "And Herod the Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before there were enmity between themselves. The enmity between them was created because of the events that occurred when Pilate became procurator. He had brought Jesus to Jerusalem and the outer walls of the temple compound. He looked at the Roman shields. And the problem for Jews is that these shields had images of the gods and goddesses that the Romans worship, and they went against Jewish sensitivities concerning idolatry. A riot broke out, and Pilate released his soldiers, and many got killed on the streets of Jerusalem on that occasion. He still refused to take the shields down. Antipas knew that as long as the shields were up, they would be a constant bullet point for rebellion. So he asked power to take the shields down. Power was still refused. And so Antipas wrote a letter to the Roman Senate, and the Roman senator ordered Pilate to take down the shields. Now he had no choice. As a result, the two became an enmity between themselves because they felt each other were not recognizing each other's authority. But now the problem is sent to the Galilean, to the one in charge of the Galilee. There's a recognition of mutual authority. They become friends at Jesus' expense. You ready to debate, code, and pray? Well, what can I say? You better pave the way. I'm not afraid to debate. Just pick the time and the date, and we'll see what you got. Not gonna hold nothing bait. Anyway. 9 years later, in the year 8039, his wife Herodotus, who had instigated, beheaded John, and had talked him into traveling to Rome to request the title of king, the same title the Senate had given to Herod the Great. She desperately wanted to be called queen, but the Roman senator, the Roman Caesar in the day, was a man named Gaius Coagula. He made no such request to Caligula. He was an insane man. He spent the treasury rather freely, mostly on pleasures, and when he ran out of money, he would simply accuse a wealthy landowner or senator of some crime against the state, have the whole family executed, and then replenish the funds again. He was so insane, he made his own horse a member of the Roman Senate, and the horse always voted this way. Things finally got so bad that the Praetorian Guard was there to protect him, ended up being the one to assassinate him. And so when they came asking for the title of a king, he simply deposed them into Lyon, which is now France. And the two died in abject poverty and paid for the row and the beheading of John and the cursing and the mocking of Jesus. The second child before Pilate. If I gotta hold down right now, I got a quiz 9. They gotta get it on my mind. Pretty soon I'm coming up on a final and it's breaking my spinal, but what can I say? I'm still gonna get it for the grade. Gonna finish the class in the best that I can, but it seems like I'm gonna take a stand. Also, I got some debates coming up in December. That's something for you to remember. Maybe you tune in and you will find a way to compete with the way that I debate, and hopefully you will see that maybe this isn't a good way for you to come into the gate. Maybe you should pick someone on a lower class weight class level. I don't know what you say, but maybe you think I'm a white devil. I'm not even sure if you're a black Hebrew Israelite, or maybe you may be Israel white. I don't know what the type you are, but it don't matter because I'm still going to give you bars, and hopefully you catch one. If not, the others will catch strays. What can I say? But now I'm going to forget about the debate and go straight to going back over the things that I'm going to be tested for. And you know what I say? You're going to see what is next in store. All right. The second child before Pilate. Paragraph 161, we come to the third stage of the civil trial. What now happens is the Pilate will make several attempts to have Jesus released, and the first attempt is in Luke's account, Luke 23, 13, and 15, which falls back on the second declaration of innocency given by Antipas. Meanwhile, Herod issues the third admission of innocency, but that won't appease the mob outside. So he falls back on a custom that developed between the Jews and the Romans that on the feast day as a good would just the Romans would release a political prisoner. We see the custom mentioned in John 18:39. All right, you want to call it excuses? So this is what you do. Contact SFT. All my debate scheduling goes through him. So you're going to contact him, or are you going to come up with excuses? We see that the custom mentioned in John 18:39 and John 18:40 says, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. The word robber in English implies someone that goes around stealing things, but that would not be punishable by death anyway. He was a robber in the sense that Josephus used the term in his works on the Jewish antiquities at Jewish War of 80-70. It's a term that's used of Jewish bands that were actually rebels who would be characterized by robbing to supply the rebellion. The fact that he was a rebel, you can see from Mark 15:7. And there was one called Barabbas lying abound with them that they made insurrection. Maybe in Luke 23:19 makes it quite clear that Barabbas was more than someone stealing things. He was a rebel robber, and he was facing his own death penalty in prison. Now, Barabbas is not a name, it's a title. It's a Hellenized title of two Aramaic words, Bar Abba. Bar meaning son of, Abba was this person's father's name. And that was his father's name, but also in Aramaic, it means the father. He was the son of Abba. He was the son of the father, but the Gospels probably do not give us his actual name to avoid confusing the reader. His actual name was. It was the same name as Jesus in Hebrew, Yeshua. He was Yeshua Barbas, Yeshua, the son of the father. He had the title of actually guilty of the very crime. The other issue is accused of, and the other issue is the true son of the truth. And this is hey, William. Now it's on the space of crimes and abuse. 17:19 when he gets him at church tradition, she became a believer. Her name was Claudia. And the interruption is long enough with the Father has given them this choice. It's also failed to have Jesus released. There comes the third attempt to have Jesus released in John's account. John 19. Well, let's get back to sharing the screen where I left off. Some of y'all might even stepped off. But what can I say? You wonder if I got slept on. But you know what left on? Go back to the current stage. All right. We'll leave off for Claudia. Now it's obvious that he anticipates him crying out for Jesus of Nazareth to be released. When the choice is getting ready to be made, the procedure is temporarily interrupted in Matthew 17:19, when he gets a message from his wife warning him not to get involved with this. Barnabas, because of a dream she had. In church tradition, she became a believer. Her name was Claudia. And the interruption is long enough for the events of Matthew 27:20. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. And that's what happens. And so a second attempt that Jesus released fails. The first attempt was with the declaration of innocency for the third time. And the second one is giving them the choice. And it's also failed to have Jesus released. Then comes the third attempt to have Jesus released in John's account. John 19:1. The Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. He tries to compromise the scourging. Then Gospels provide no details about the scourge, because when the Gospels were written, nobody knew what a scourge entailed. By 2,000 years later, we don't always appreciate the amount of suffering he suffered before he got to the cross. There are two kinds of scourging. There was the Jewish scourging and the Roman scourging. The Jewish scourging was called 40 save 1. And why 40 save 1? In the Mosaic law, no one could be lashed more than 40 lashes. And so it's part of, and the question came up, suppose the last was lashed and mistakes around the town would stop at 39 just to play it safe. Hence 40 save 1. And the Jewish scourge had a wooden or leather handle with short leather strands, and only part of the body affected was the victim's back. While it was very painful, it was never deadly. No one ever died of a Jewish scourge. And Paul said he suffered a Jewish scourge 5 times and survived all 5 scourges. But Jesus has now suffered the Jewish scourge. He suffers the Roman scourge, which is far more severe. No limitations on how many lashes can be given. The Roman scourge had a handle with wood or leather, but the straps were long enough to go around the whole body. The whole body was affected. The strand was a piece of sharp metal or glass or lamb bone. So after only a few lashes would go flying, and many never survived the Roman scourge. And furthermore, because they went around his face, the face would have been rather disfigured. One of the misconceptions we have that comes from the crucifixion paintings, they show the face of Jesus intact except for the crown of thorns. Actually, the face was a very pulpy mask. In the records we have, sometimes even family members could not recognize the victim anymore. And this fulfills the messianic prophecy of Isaiah 53, 52 and 13 through 53 and 12. His visage was so marred and so disfigured he was held. And this is one example. He suffered a great deal of physical torture before he even got to the cross. And this is now his third physical mistreatment. We also have here the third mockery. Because of this, the scourging was not enough that they put upon a purple colored cloth that will resemble a robe. They put on his head a crown made of thorns. In Israel, these thorns come to razor point sharp. It was brushed against one lightly, it could still cause you to bleed. And it says they keep hitting him. The hitting was included the thorns on the crown. The thorns would go deeply into the brow. And Pilate hopes it will be sufficient. And in John's account, John 19:5, it brings him out and issues forth the declaration of innocency. Now the response of the crowd is still to cry out for the crucifixion in John 19:5 and 6. He then makes a fourth attempt at Jesus to release by simply refusing to pass Roman sentence at the end of John 19:6. Now keep in mind, for the Roman perspective of the day, and by Roman law, he would have the final decision whether Jesus would die or not. If he does not pass Roman sentence, Jesus cannot die, and so he refuses to pass Roman sentence at this stage, and that causes the multitudes of the mob in John 19:7 to finally drop the charge of sedition. And in verse 7, he points out, we have a law, and by that law we ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. They drop the charge of sedition and go back to the real issue that's been troubling, the issue of him claiming to be the Messiah. And now the crowd has a new accusation, so they have a new interview. He tries to have one in John 19:8 and 11, but this time Jesus will not answer any more of his questions. But now he receives sufficient light to respond correctly. He responds incorrectly with a sarcastic, what is true is not known, for the light will be given to him. And when Pilate presses him to answer, because he's got the authority to release him or crucify him, Jesus reminds him all governing authorities only delegated from above. He has delegated authority only, not final authority. And furthermore, the one who turned him over to him will be guilty of the greater sin. There are differences in sin. In 12, upon the Pilate saw his friend, everyone that makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Pilate therefore, what for? Heard these words. What words? If you release him, you're not Caesar's friend. He then takes his place upon the judgment seat, and from the judgment seat, a verdict must be issued. If the verdict is guilty, a sentence must be issued. And the question is, why would he be intimidated by this one crime? What does he care what they say? And normally he would not care, but Pilate's in a difficult situation because of events going on back in Rome, because Pilate got his job as procurator at the influence of a friend named Sejanus. Sejanus was the captain of the Praetorian Guard, a friend of Pilate. And when he became captain of the Praetorian Guard, an influential position, he got the job for Pilate to become procurator of Judah and, Samaria. But then Sejanus decided he would prefer to be emperor. He organized a conspiracy against the emperor Tiberius, and the conspiracy was uncovered before it could be carried out. Sejanus and other co-conspirators have been executed, and now the Senate was investigating everybody connected with Sejanus to see if they were part of the conspiracy. And so Pilate himself will be under investigation. The last thing he needs is for word to get back to Rome that he released a man claiming to be king and therefore comparative to Caesar. And that's why the cry is sufficient to put him on the judgment seat. Now for the judgment seat, he makes a sixth and last attempt at Jesus' release by bringing them out at John 18:4 and saying, behold your king. And in John 18:5, they respond, we have no king but Caesar. And they disown Jesus as the king and own Caesar as king. And Pilate still made no further attempt to get Jesus released. Instead, in Matthew 27:24, he calls for a pail and pitcher of water and washes his hands, assuming that merely washing his hand exempts us from any guilt. It does not. The final decision whether Jesus lives or dies was only his to make. He knew what the right decision should have been, but he made the wrong decision based upon what they were saying, and merely washing his hand would not absolve him of the guilt, because it was up to him to make the final decision from a human perspective. And the early church did not absolve him. So, for example, when Peter preaches his message in Acts 3, he names several men guilty of the death of Jesus. Among the ones he names is Pontius Pilate. The earliest church creed we have is called the Apostles' Creed. One of the sentences in the Apostles' Creed says he suffered under Pontius Pilate and did not exempt him either. And in year 36, he was finally deposed, banished to Gaul in the area of Vienna, Austria today. He was sent away by Coagula, where he later committed suicide and paid for his role in the role of his trial. At Matthew 27:24, he makes his fifth declaration of innocency. Now, with the 5 declarations of innocency, this is the most significant because it's made from the judgment seat. And they respond in 27:25, his blood be upon us. Now, notice only Matthew mentions this because Matthew is the one that traces the consequences of the pardonable sin. And notice the curse of the blood is limited to them and their children. It goes no further. There's no mention of the 3rd and 4th generation. And in the year 80-70, it's finally upon them and their children. In Luke's account, in Luke 23:24, he issues the death sentence against Jesus, and in verse 25, he releases Barabbas. And there's a symbolic substitution. The innocent one will die in place of the guilty one. In Matthew 27:26, he turns Jesus over to be crucified. The mockery. Now, paragraph 162, we have the mockery. This time, the whole Roman cohort takes charge. He undergoes now the fourth mockery and the last mistreatment before he goes on the cross. Procession to the Calvary. Now, capital D, we come to the procession to Calvary, paragraph 163. And the whole death scene begins here and continues until the sealing of the tomb. And between the procession and the sealing of the tomb, there will be 32 distinct stages. And the best way to deal with the material is to go and chronologically is to deal with the stage by stage, making comments as we proceed. Some will have less comments than others, and the first 5 stages happen under capital D, the procession to Calvary. Right now, William, I'm chilling. I ain't got time to look at the OSAS. What can I say? I got so many things I got to hold back. So what I'm going to say, it's a no pass. I'll go back and get on those things after I finish this task. Until then, sit back, relax, and listen to the scene, listen to the view, and hopefully you learn a thing or two. In the first stage in John's account, John 19, 16, and 17, where he carries his own cross to the Praetorian. This is a standard Roman procedure. The victim would carry his own cross to the crucifixion site. Now, normally, a person was not scourged beforehand, but as part of the Pilate's compromise, he had Jews scourged, so the body is very weakened by it, so he can only carry the cross so far, and at least carry the cross by, maybe not the whole cross. So Mark 15:21, they forced a man named Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross the rest of the way. Cyrene is located in North Africa, and so Simon was a Jew from North Africa that came to observe the Passover at Jerusalem. Now again, the city could not contain all of the pilgrims, so most pilgrims ate their Passover outside the walls in the tent cities erected. The next morning, they were going to the city to observe the special Passover sacrifice, and that's when Simon was apparently doomed when he found himself forced to carry the cross the rest of the way. Now, in Matthew 17:32 and Luke 23:26 also mentioned the face that Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry the cross the rest of the way. Only Mark makes the point he's the father of Alexander and Rufus, which means that was significant to the audience that Mark was writing, not significant to the audience that Matthew and Luke were writing. This becomes significant, and we keep in mind that Mark wrote the gospel to the Romans, and when Paul writes a letter to the Romans, Romans 16:13, he does mention the names of some family. What this shows is the event led to the salvation of Simon, his wife mentioned in Romans account, and the 2 sons named here. Now, what caused Simon to respond favorably, we're not told. We have records of other crucifixions. The way Jesus responds to his own crucifixion is radically different. Other victims would yell and scream, call out all kinds of curses to the tormentors, and sometimes the screaming, the yelling, and the cursing got so bad the soldiers would cut out the tongue of the victim just to shut him up. But Jesus did not cry. He does not curse to be the Messiah, and he became a believer in Romans 1. The church of Rome was not planted by one of the apostles. It was planted by Jewish believers that had migrated to Rome. That would have included apparently the family of Cyrene. So the small event had long-time consequences all the way to Rome. The third stage in Luke's account, Luke 23:27 to 31, the lament over Jerusalem. As they're headed for the crucifixion site, and notice again, Luke alone quotes this because of the role of the women here. One of the 3 concerns in Luke's gospel, and these are not the women that came up from Galilee with them. These are local women who calls him the daughters of Jerusalem. What's happened here is also a traditional custom that when a Jewish man is be taken out of execution by Gentile authorities, as is the case here, the professional wailers, lamenters who would go out with a loud lamentation, just as you still hear at certain kinds of Jewish funerals. As when the wailing goes on, he suddenly starts a procession that says, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, and keep it with the curse they took upon it, the child. Because while the 70 AD will be severe for the country as a whole, it will be especially severe for those in Jerusalem. And in Luke 23:31, he says, for if they do these things in the green tree, what should be done in the dry? This is a Jewish idiom, meaning if I suffered this much when I'm innocent, how much more are you going to suffer that are guilty? The background to the idiom is Ezekiel 20:47. The 4th stage is in Mark's account, Mark 15:22, the rival of Golgotha. In Aramaic term that means the place of the skull, and all 4 gospels make the point rather simply, the place of the skull. Notice, not one of them actually says that it looked like a skull. Maybe you may have seen the slides that people come back from Israel. They will show you that the low-lying cliff with 2 holes there gives the impression of a skull. This has become the Protestant side of the crucifixion since about the 1880s. Thus, always in such a nice way. Ever notice there's something about an Arab bus station right there because it kind of spoiled the feeling. And also what the guys don't tell you is that the holes were dug out in the 1800s. That was the area. It doesn't mean it looked like a skull. Only was the place of the skull, the place of crucifixion. There are similar things in America here in Dodge City, Kansas, a place called Boot Hill. And I've been there twice. It's not Boot Hill because it's shaped like a gigantic boot. It's called Boot Hill because of what happened there. Gunfighters are buried with their boots on. That's how it's intended to be mean here. It's not that it looked like a skull. It means the place of skull, the place of execution. And between the Protestant and Calvary site, at this point, the Calvary site is in the correct site. The more correct site, not based on Calvary tradition, based upon Jewish traditions of Messianic history and archaeology. Now, if you go back to page 226 and look at the footnote, he mentioned the sepulcher. Could not be because it stands within the walls. He wrote this in late 1800s, so early 1900s, before the archaeology actually discovered the walls. The walls, the present-day walls, are built by the Turks in the 1500s. Where the church stands today was outside the wall in the 1st century. The walls did not follow the same lines in every case. Now, the 5th stage is the refusal to drink a mixture. They offered him in Mark 15:23, wine mingled with myrrh. Matthew adds it was mingled with gall. This was a mixed drink given to a victim just before the nailing because it would help deaden the pain. It also makes you very lightheaded, and because he must have full control of his senses because of spiritual conflict he has to fight on the cross. He refused to partake of this mixture. It also means he will suffer the pain that much more severely than the others being crucified with them. Okay, so now we're in section 9, the rejection of the king, the trial and death of the Messiah, and section E, the crucifixion, and the first 3 hours, the wrath of men. We come to paragraph 164, 166, the crucifixion. It's on the 15th of Nisan, April 70 AD 30, and that's probably April 7th. And the first 3 hours on the cross, we suffered the wrath of man. It is now Friday morning from 9 a.m. to 12 noon. And this segment is going to contain 6 stages through 17. And the 6th stage is the actual crucifixion. Mark 15:24, they crucify him. Matthew, Luke, and John just as simplified. Mark adds in Mark 15:25. And it was the 3rd hour that they crucified him, responding to our present day 9 a.m. So keep in mind it's now 9 o'clock in the morning of the first day of the Passover. At visualized 2 months, the Temple Mount and the Mount of Golgotha. The Temple Mount, the literal lamb, was now being offered up as Passover sacrifice. And now on this other mount, the Passover Lamb of God was being offered up. Now, as it was with the scourges, so is with the crucifixion. No details are given. Because when the Gospels were written, people all knew what a crucifixion entailed. But now, 2,000 years later, many don't understand the fullness of it. And there are also some misconceptions we have because the way the crucifixion has been painted in the preceding centuries. So we have to focus just for a few minutes on this. And so he's given the different ways that the cross is being used here. It's possible it could have been this one. The title would be at the top. It could be a beam one. He's saying it's not the X one. And it's not this one here where the title's at the bottom, but there's a T-bar at the cross. He thinks it's number 4 where you have the title and you have the cross and you also have the stand. The Romans used 4 different types of crosses. The first type was the telephone pole type, though not anywhere near as smooth. The second type was a capital X format, and in church tradition, Peter was crucified on this kind of cross upside down. The third type was a capital T format, and the fourth type is a more traditional small t format. We don't have enough information within the Gospels to know with 100% certainty what kind of was actually used. We can reach a high level of probability, but there will always be a measure of doubt as exactly the kind of cross that was used. Now, generally speaking, the first 2 types of crosses were not used outside of Italy. If we could say they were never used outside of Italy, then we could just rule them out, but there are some exceptions, and therefore they cannot be entirely ruled out. If our choice only between the 3rd and the 4th type of the cross, then we know what kind it was. Because part of the procedure is to nail on the cross a documented piece of wood that will spell out the reason why the person was being crucified. Now, in the capital T format, they put it below the feet. But in the small t format, they put it over the head. We'll see momentarily that they put it over the head of Jesus. So if the only choice is between the 3rd and the 4th, then the 4th would be the correct choice, not the 3rd. However, they also put it over the head in the telephone pole type. They cannot be entirely ruled out. So I'd say it's about a 5 to 10% chance it was the first kind, and 90 to 95 chance it was the last type. The only difference it will make for the rest of my discussion is that the hands were crisscrossed and not stretched out. The cross was laid on the ground, and the person who laid on top of the cross, 2 nails were used in the first cross. 3 nails were used in the second cross. And one misconception we get for crucifixion paintings is that the nails were going through the palm of the hand, but the bone structure in the palm would not be strong enough to hold up the weight of a full-grown human body. And the actual place where the nails were placed was in the wrist here and here on through both, because the nail structure there would hold up the weight of a full-grown human body. The feet were placed on top of the ankles in such a way the nail went through the feet, through the back heel into the wood, and there the feet would touch the cross. They would also put a small ledge, and I'll explain the reason for the ledge a bit later. Once all the nails were inserted, the cross was picked up and then dropped into the dirt for it. And because the weight of the body was stretched out and the drop of bones would be pulled down a joint, fulfilling the prophecy of Psalm 22. It's not merely a matter of waiting or while they were not given any food. While they were on the cross, they were given whatever liquid they wanted. And sometimes it would be days before someone died this way. Now, the seventh stage in Luke's account, Luke 23 to 34, we have the first of 7 statements from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. He prays for the forgiveness of those who crucify him, but the prayer for forgiveness is limited to those who do it in ignorance. That would not include people like Annas and Caiaphas, Pilate, or Herod, Antipas, and others who knew what they were doing. It would include the other Jewish leaders that may have done it in ignorance, and more specifically, Roman soldiers involved in crucifying him. The 8th stage is in John's account in John 19, the parting of the garments. Now, part of the procedure on the Roman system is that the soldiers involved in the crucifixion would have the right of the clothes of the victim as spoil. Another misconception we have of the crucifixion is painting. We always saw Jesus wearing a loincloth. Actually, they were crucified naked. By Jewish context, that would add to the shame of it all. The average Jewish male in the first century Israel wore 5 pieces of clothing. First of all, the upper garment, also called the outer garment, upper garment or outer garment. The second item was called the inner garment or undergarment or tunic. The third piece was some kind of head covering. Fourthly was shoes or sandals. And fifth was the outer robe or the outer coat, which itself was a larger single piece of cloth. Now, at each crucifixion site, 4 soldiers will be involved, so each one walks away with a piece of clothing. So one had the upper garment, one the undergarment, one the head covering, and on the shoes. Because the outer robe itself was the largest single piece of cloth, they would normally tear it into 4 parts, and every soldier walked away with a piece of cloth. But the kind of coat he wore was the kind of coat normally worn by the wealthy class, and because of its uniqueness, they decided not to tear it apart, but to gamble it and cast lots for it. And one soldier walked away with the whole robe, fulfilling the prophecy, also Psalms 22. We know earlier Jesus lived on the poverty level, so how did he get this kind of coat? And we do not know for certain, but we have one hint that we saw back in Luke 8, 1 and 3. This ministry was financed by several wealthy women, and it would be one of these wealthy women gave him the coat. Now, the 9th stage is direction of the superscription. In John's account, John 19, 19, 22, Matthew 27 and 37 specifies it's placed over his head. That's how, if we know we have to choose between the 3rd and 4th, that the 4th is the correct choice. And again, normally they would spell out the accusation of the crime he was guilty of, but the way Pilate chooses to word it does not read it like an accusation. It reads like a simple title: Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. He even spelled it out in 3 different languages: in Hebrew for the Jews, Latin for the Romans, and Greek for everybody else. The leaders understand the way it reads. It reads like a title, not an accusation. If they ask Pilate to change the wording, he refuses to do it and has a small piece of revenge against those who pursued him to do something he didn't want to do. Now, the 10th stage is the co-crucifixion of 2 other men in Matthew 27:38. Then are they crucified with him 2 robbers. Again, this should be rebel robbers or rebels. 2 men that participated in the rebellion of Barabbas. Barabbas got released from the Passover. These ones were not so fortunate. They co-crucified with him, one on his right side and one on his left side, fulfilling the prophecy, Isaiah 53:12. He was numbered among the transgressors. I've done some research to see if we can determine who the other 2 men were. I still don't know who one of them is, but I believe I finally discovered who the other one was. Now, this is a joke, guys. One of these 2 men was the father of the Apostle Paul, because Romans 6, Paul says, my old man was crucified with him. Get it? How many of you wrote that down before you realized it was a joke? The 11th stage is the 5th mockery. These are 4 more mockeries when he's on the cross. The 5th mockery is Mark 15, 29 and 30, committed by those who simply happen to be passing by. The site of the crucifixion is right near one of the gates, now open for Passover morning. Traffic in and out. They can see who hangs on there. They can read the title or accusation. They can reduce it to a mockery. The 12 stages in Mark's account, Mark 15, 31 and 32, which is the 12th stage in the 6th mockery. This is committed by the Jewish leaders. He mentions the scribes who were Pharisees and the chief priests who were Sadducees. And Matthew mentions the elders, also Pharisees, so both Sadducees and Pharisees mock him while he's on the cross. The 13th stage is the 7th mockery in Luke's account, Luke 23, 33 to 37, committed by the Roman soldiers, actively crucifying him. So both Jews and Gentiles become guilty of mocking him while he was on the cross. The 14th stage in Matthew's account, Matthew 27, 44, we have the 8th mockery, and this is committed by both men who were co-crucified with him. And notice that initially both of them participate in mocking him. The 11th, 12th, and 13th, 14th stages, there are 4 mockeries by 4 different groups, but there are 2 common elements in all 4 mockeries. First of all 4 groups mocked specific messianic claims he had made during his public ministry. He made several different kinds of claims on messianic, and now they take one or more of these claims and reduce it to mockery. But secondly, all 4 groups challenge him to prove his messiahship by coming down from the cross, to prove his claims by coming down from the cross. Now, if Jesus had taken and accepted their challenge, it would have proved him to be a false messiah. What we have here is Satan's last attempt to keep Jesus from the cross at this point. So again, while he wants him dead, he doesn't want him to die at that time and in this way. And with each of these 4 mockeries, using the pride of life motif, he wants to get him to come down off the cross. If he uses maximum power to come off the cross, it would have proved him to be the false Messiah. This is the way the Messiah was supposed to die, keeping with Psalms 22, Isaiah 53. His refusal to come off the cross becomes evidence of the Messiahship, not a negation of it. The 15th stage in Luke's account is Luke 23, 39 and 42. We have the conversion of the 2 men co-crucified with him. Now, initially, they both participated in mocking him, but as one had time to think and to reflect, he came to the same conclusion that Simon the Cyrene did. And if we look at what he says to Jesus, to his co-rebel, he came to the 4 conclusions. First of all, he realized that he was a sinner, an important conclusion, because you never recognize your need for a savior until we see ourselves as God sees us, as sinners. Secondly, he came to the conclusion that Jesus himself was sinless, in spite of the accusation he's hearing and the mockeries he's hearing. He came to realize that Jesus himself was sinless. Thirdly, he came to conclude that Jesus could save him. That's amazing, because he could see that he was dying the same kind of death that himself was dying. But he came to conclude, in spite of the fact he was dying, Jesus could save him. And fourthly, he came to recognize that this one would come again in this kingdom. Again, an amazing conclusion. He could see it there. Jesus was dying, but he knew he'd come again with this kingdom. And he requested to be remembered when he come back with this kingdom. And this brings on the 16th stage in Luke 23, 43, which is the second statement from the cross. I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. And the point is, you won't have to wait till the kingdom to remember. He'll remember this very same day. On this day, both will die. And once they die and go to Abraham's bosom, and that will verify the truth of his claims, which the other 4 groups are mocking. The 7th stage is in John's account, John 19, 25 and 27. Here we have the 3rd statement from the cross. At this point, several women come to the foot of the cross. 4 women in particular. There's Mary Magdalene, who plays a more significant role with the resurrection. We have the second Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, in John 19:25. She's referred to as the wife of Clopas. Clopas will play a role in the resurrection account. So this Mary was the wife of Clopas and the mother of James and Joseph in Mark 15:14 and Matthew 27:56. She was the mother of 2 of Jesus' disciples. This is a tradition that Clopas was the mother of Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus. There was a tradition. We don't know the facts of it that Clopas was the mother of Joseph. If that's the case, James and Judas would have been cousins of Jesus, if the tradition is correct. All right. The 3rd woman is Salome, mentioned in Mark 15:40. Salome is the Hellenized form of the Hebrew Shulamit, and in Matthew 27:56, she's the mother of the sons of Zebedee, John and James. In John 19:25, she's the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. So that means she was the aunt of Jesus, and her 2 sons were cousins of Jesus. And the 4th woman that plays a role here is Mary, his mother. In Hebrew, there's all these Miriams, which was a very common name in 1st century Israel. And in John 19:27, he says, "Their woman, behold your son." And then to John, he says, "Behold your mother." When he tells Mary, "Behold your son," he's not referring to himself. He's referring to John. Just as when he says to John, "Behold your mother," He's not referring to John's mother, but to the mother of Jesus. He's still fulfilling the Mosaic law perfectly. The firstborn son was to take care of the welfare of a widowed mother. He's going to be living earth, so he won't be able to continue doing it from a physical perspective. He does have 4 half-brothers who are now unbelievers, and so he does not choose to deliver his mother's welfare into the hands of an unbeliever, but gives over to John. He says to the woman, "Behold your son," meaning John. He must look to John for a physical welfare. When he tells John, "Behold your mother," he gives John the responsibility, which he accepts, in verse 27 ends. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his home. And that marks the end of the first 3 hours on the cross in which he suffered the wrath of man. The second 3 hours, the wrath of God. Now, paragraph 165, we come to the second 3 hours of the cross, where he will suffer the wrath of God. The second 3 hours of the cross will cover 12 noon until 3 in the afternoon. Now, Luke's account in Luke 23, 44, and 45 mentions the fact that darkness envelops the whole land, a thick darkness that lasts for a full 3 hours, the same 3 hours which normally are the brightest time of the day in the land of Israel. It also extends to the surrounding territories, apparently. If this darkness was as extensive as they claimed, you would think there would be some other record of it. In archaeology, they discovered 3 other records of what happens here. 2 come from Egypt, south of Israel, and 1 comes from Turkey, now north of Israel. The first one from Egypt is by a Greek scientist by Dionysius. He reports seeing the darkness of the city of Hierapolis in Egypt. There's a tone of irony because Hierapolis in Greek means the city of the sun, but the sun had been blacked out in the brightest time of the day. The second source also comes from a Greek scientist in Egypt. His name is Diogenes. I'll quote you what he wrote. Now keep in mind he was pagan, and yet he has some measure of spiritual insight. There was a solar darkness as such like that either the deity himself suffered, or at the moment to sympathize with one that did. I repeat that. There was a darkness as such like that either the deity suffered at the moment or sympathized with one who did. He had no way of knowing this, but both statements are true. Deity suffering at the moment. God the Son suffered at the moment. The third writer is a Roman writer named Phlegon. Phlegon lived in Asia Minor. Asia Minor is now Turkey, and he writes this: there was a great and remarkable eclipse of the sun above any that ever happened before. At the 6th hour of the day was turned into the darkness of the night, so the stars was in heaven. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, which overthrew many of the houses in Nicaea. He mentions not only a darkness, a very thick darkness, he also mentions the earthquake. As you used to see, the moment death occurs, an earthquake also occurs. Now, more important for us is the theological significance of the darkness. That's what we covered earlier in the Garden of Gethsemane experience. It marks a point of a spiritual death. There's a separation for the Father. For 3 hours he separated, and for 3 hours he suffers the wrath of God. By the way, this paragraph contains stages 19 through 25. The 20th stage is in Matthew's account, Matthew 27 and 46, where he cries out, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It's a quotation of Psalms 22:1, a Jewish practice. When you quote the first verse of a segment, you imply the whole segment. The point is, he applied the whole psalm to himself. Now, taken out of context, it might seem like a cry of despair, but in the context of Psalms 22, it's a cry for help. A cry for help that comes at the end of having suffered 3 hours of the wrath of God for our sins. It was the only time he addressed him as Eli, Eli, my God, my God. 170 times in the gospel. 170 times he calls him Father. And 21 times he calls him my Father. The only time he calls him addressing him, my God, is right here. Because he does not have a paternal relationship. It's now a judicial relationship. It's not Abi, my father, but Eli, Eli, my God, my God. It's a cry that is answered. He both dies spiritually and is resurrected spiritually before he even dies physically. I'm not evaluating this, just reading it. Now, the 18th stage was the darkness. The 19th stage was a cry. The 20th stage in Matthew 27, 47, and 49. The response of those standing by. And they misinterpret what he said because in Hebrew, Eli, Eli does mean my God, my God. But also Eli is a short form for the name Elijah. To the Hebrew ear, Eli could mean my God, Eli could mean Elijah, and they assume he's calling for Elijah to come and rescue him. There are some in the crowd that assume he might be getting delirious and bring some vinegar to him, but the others call him back and say, let's wait and see if Elijah will come to rescue him. The 24th stage is John's account. John 19:28, we have the 5th statement from the cross, I thirst. In Luke 16:22 and 24, when he told the story of the rich man and Lazarus, when the rich man suffered the pains, the wrath of God in hell, his response was, I thirst. Now Jesus has suffered the wrath of God. He responds in a very similar way. I thirst. The 22nd stage in John 19:29, where he partakes of the vinegar. This was not the mixed drink that he was offered earlier. This would help moisten his lips, his tongue, and his mouth, so the last two statements on the cross can be said clearly and distinctly. Then came the 23rd stage at the sixth statement for the cross in John 19:30. It is finished. Those three words make up one Greek word, tetelestai. Doesn't mean it is finished, but in a unique way. A few years ago, archaeologists were digging and uncovered the office of the ancient CPA. What they found was a stack of invoices, a stack of bills, and across each bill was the one word written, tetelestai. It does mean it's finished in the sense of being paid in full. All of the blood animal sacrifices were now paid in full. The animal sacrifice is nothing but installment payments. Now the shedding of his own blood makes a final payment for what sin required. Hey, Big Stack. Hi, Michael Lionheart. Oh, no, this is not an open stream. This is me doing my homework stream. But welcome to the channel. Now, the 24th stage is the seventh statement for the cross. Is found in Luke's account, Luke 23:46. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he cried, which is tetelestai. And then he says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. That's your seventh statement for the cross. Notice the voluntary character of his death. Notice how he addressed God again, now as Father. The restoration of the paternal relationship, and again, he both dies spiritually and is resurrected spiritually before he dies physically. And the word means to dismiss. He dismissed the spirit from the body. He chooses the moment of his death and then hands over his human spirit from the safekeeping of God the Father. Now, the 25th stage you have is actual physical death at the end of Mark 15:37. He gave up the spirit. In Mark 27:50, he yielded up his spirit. In Luke 23:46, he gave up the spirit. In John 19:30, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Normally, when you die and your head falls, but he put his head down. He dismissed the spirit from his body. When Paul spells out the content of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15:1-4, he points out that there are three things we have to believe for our salvation. And the first thing is that he died for our sins. The death of Christ is what made the atonement. The New Testament develops a great tale, the theological implications. The result of his death that we're going to survey for a couple minutes because it's very significant. No, I'm not scared of informal debates. I just ain't got time for it right now. If you think I'm scared, why don't you watch when I pulled up on the Black Hebrew Israelites? Why don't you see when I pulled up on Mahler? Why don't you see when I pulled up on JP? I ain't scared. I ain't never scared, as they say. I just prefer formal debates. I spar on Clubhouse too. Anyway, and Discord. The New Testament develops in great detail the theological implications. The result of his death for the Garden survey for a couple of minutes because it's very significant. First of all, his death is a satisfaction. It means a full legal equivalent of the wrong done. The law has been satisfied what is demanded according to the wrong done. His death answered all the demands of God's law and justice against the sinner. Romans 3. Galatians 1, Ephesians 5. Secondly, his death resulted in redemption. It means his death paid the price for the penalty of sin. There are 7 different Greek words that all come out as redemption in English. What it emphasizes, believers have been purchased out of the slave market of sin and set free. They have been purchased from the slave market of sin and set free. The redemption of the believer occurs in 5 different areas. First, we have been redeemed from the penalty of the law. This applies especially to Jewish believers. Gentiles are not under the law, Galatians 3:13. We've also been redeemed from the law itself. Jewish believers are now free from having to obey the Mosaic law. We are now under a new law, the law of the Messiah, Romans 6:14, Romans 7:24, Galatians 4:4 and 5. Thirdly, we've been redeemed from the power of sin that includes both Jews and Gentiles. We're not obligated to obey the sin nature any more than Romans 5:18 and 19, Romans 6:6, 6:14. Fourthly, we've been redeemed from the power of Satan. A believer is no longer obligated to obey Satan. Galatians 2:15, Hebrews 2:15. And fifthly, believers are guaranteed future final redemption from all evil, which will occur when the resurrection of the body occurs. Luke 21:28, Romans 8:23, Ephesians 1:14 and 4:30. Yeah, I don't know what this code and pray is. I don't know who he is. Why would I? Well, I mean, first off, I'm gonna tell you right now, dude. If you're not here to learn, you're just gonna be hidden. All right. Don't say I'm scared when I'm doing my seminary assignment. You know what? I'm scared of my professor more than you. I'm scared of deadlines more than you. So you need to chill with that, or you will be hidden. Because this is the layman's seminary. If you can't do it in seminary, you're not gonna do it here. And you coming in here with this energy talking about you won't drop the link. But this is a seminary. That means the faculty determines the curriculum. So if you get invited to something, you abide by them rules. Or you can find another channel to troll. Alright. The third result of propitiation, it means that God is satisfied with the death the Messiah accomplished. It's to appease the wrath of God against sin, to propitiate, to appease the wrath of God against sin. It does not mean that his death merely satisfied a vengeful God. It satisfies the God who is just, righteous, and holy, and the wrath of God was poured out against sin. Number 4, it was also a reconciliation. Definition means a change of relationship of one person to another person, to change from enmity to friendship. The point is this: the position of the world was changed by his death, so all men are now able to be saved. His death rendered the whole world savable, though salvation will apply only to the individual who will believe. Romans 5:10, Colossians 1:20, 2 Corinthians 5:19. The fifth result, there was a ransom. It means the blood of the Messiah was the price that has to be paid for the penalty of sin. The blood of the Messiah was the death of the Messiah is the ransom paid by a holy law of God. Matthew 20:28, 1 Timothy 2:6. Number 6, it was the proof of the love of God for sinners. The evidence is that he died for the world in a sinful state, not in a redeemed state. John 3:16, John 4:9, Romans 5:1-8. He does not die for us when he was his friends. He died for us when we were still enemies. Number 7 is the judgment of our sin nature. He rendered inoperative the reigning power of the sin nature's authority over the believer. So when we sin today, we merely submit to the will of the sin nature, but we don't have to. We all end up doing it. We don't have to. The sin nature is not removed when I believe. You still have it, but it's judged and condemned in Romans 6:1-10. Number 8, it marks the end of the law of Moses as the rule of life. His death marked the end of the Mosaic law. Believers are no longer under the law of Moses, but under a new law, the law of Messiah. Romans 7, Romans 10, Colossians 2, Hebrews 7, Hebrews 8, Ephesians 2, Galatians 3. Number 9, it's the basis of the continuing cleansing of the sin. We still sin and we're continuously being cleansed at the basis of Christ's death. This is the basic rule for all sins, following salvation. It's family forgiveness based upon the blood in John 1:7-19. But number 10, it's also the basis to the removal of the pre-cross sins. He didn't die only for sins committed after his death. He died for all sins committed before his death. Thus he died for the sins of the Old Testament saints. Animal blood was not sufficient to take away sins. Animal blood was able to cover sins, but not remove from sin. Hebrews 10, only his death could accomplish the removal of the pre-cross sins. Acts 17, Romans 3:25, Hebrews 9, and Hebrews 10:4. Number 11, the judgment of Satan and his hosts. Now, based with the judgment of Satan and every fallen angel or demon at the great white throne judgment. After the Messianic kingdom, the basis the blood of Christ. John 12:31, John 16:11, Colossians 2:14. It was the basis for the deferment of righteous divine judgment. God has deferred judgment until the end of time, but it's based upon the death of Messiah. And God is a right to judge men immediately, but justice is deferred, delayed, and because of his death, Romans 2, Romans 9, 1 Peter 3, 1 Peter 3, 9, and 15. 13, his blood was resulted in purification of things in heaven. The blood of Jesus was used to cleanse the heavenly sanctuary, which had been defiled by Satan's fall. Romans 8, Hebrews 9. 14, it's the ground for peace between God and man. Romans 5, ground for peace between Jews and Gentiles. Ephesians 2, Colossians 3, it's a ground for peace in the universe. Colossians 1:20. 15, it's also the basis for the national salvation of Israel in the future. Someday all Israel will believe on it. Deuteronomy 30, Jeremiah 31, Romans 11. Number 16, it's the basis of the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Revelation 5 makes a point that Messianic kingdom could not be established apart from the death of the Messiah. The accompanying signs. Let's go to paragraph 166, the accompanying signs. The moment he dies, several things happen in rather quick succession. First of all, in Matthew 27:51, a tremendous earthquake hits. Secondly, in Matthew 27:52-53, the tombs are open. Tombs meaning caves. tombs, not graves below the ground, and many saints, many believers who were dead were now resurrected. And notice the word, and they were resurrected the moment he dies. They did not come out of the tombs until his own resurrection. They stay in the tombs until he's resurrected. But they're resurrected the moment he dies, providing the picture by his death, he provides life. Now, this is not the resurrection of the Old Testament saints into immortality, because that won't happen until the second coming in Daniel 12:2. This was merely a restoration back to natural life of things that had not been dead all of that long, or they stay in the tomb until its resurrection. Then they go into the city. In Matthew 27:53, Jerusalem had appeared to many. We have no other record of these activities after the verse, because no one could be raised into immortality before Jesus' own resurrection. These all died again later. Now, another event that occurred in Mark 15:38 is the wrenching of the veil, a tear that began at the top and worked its way to the bottom. If a man came in to try to do this, this would take the bottom, tear the bottom and from the top. But he points out the tear begins at the top that works its way down to the bottom. Now keep in mind when the veil was. It was 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, and it's about 4 inches thick. And the significance of this spells out in the book of Hebrews in particular, and now access to God was made available to all. And when the Mosaic law was in operation, only one man can enter into God's presence. That was the Jewish high priest. Even from him, only one day in the whole year. Only one man out of one family, out of one clan, out of one tribe, out of one nation, out of one race could have access to God's presence. The Jewish high priest, even for him, only one day in the whole year, the Day of Atonement. But now that the veil had been rent, signifying the end of the Mosaic law, access is made available to all who believe. Outside the Gospels, the Jewish writings, there's no mention of this particular event. There's no other mention of this outside the Gospels. To keep in mind, only a few men had the authority to go inside the temple, so only a few would even notice that it was torn, and it could be kept really quiet. But now, what we do have in Jewish writing shortly after this period is a number of legends. The two common elements of these legends. Number one, they all concern the temple in some respect. The second, they're all dated the same way. This or that happened 40 years before the temple was destroyed. And again, the temple was destroyed in the year 8070. Subtract 40 years, that's the year 8040, the year of his death. There are many such legends. I'm going to give you just 4 as a taste. There is much more than these 4 I'm giving you. The first one, mentioned by Josephus, is that in the first room there were 7 branch lampstands. The middle lamp kept going out inexplicably. For some reason, it just kept going out as of the year AD 30. The second legend is mentioned by both Josephus and the Talmud. And the heavy temple doors that took several men to swung open on their accord in the year AD 30. And the Talmud says that the key rabbi of the day, one name, said that was the sign that the temple was destined to be destroyed, but it happened in the year AD 30. A third legend says the lintel of the doorway of the temple cracked and fell that year. There are some others. I'll give you my favorite. One is called the legend of Azazel. Azazel, a word that means removal, now becomes a technical name for the scapegoat. Now, on the day of the atonement, on the day 2 goats were presented before the high priest. 1 goat was chosen to live and 1 goat was chosen to die. The goat chosen to die would be killed by the altar, the blood taken into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled upon the mercy seat, which was the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. When the priest came out, he laid his hands upon the head of the live goat, and he laid his hands upon the live goat. The goat began speaking in tongues. Whoa. Charismatic goat. No, scratch that. Just checking if you're awake out there. He's making a joke. Laying on of hands was the Old Testament symbol identification, and now the goat was identified with the people of Israel. The high priest confessed the sins of Israel, and the goat was driven out of the camp, out into the wilderness. The picture conveyed is by the shedding of blood in the first goat. The second goat can bear the sins outside the camp. That's as far as the law of the Moses went in Leviticus 16, because of what Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 118. Though their sins be as scarlet, they should be white as snow. The Jewish legend says that before the live goat, the scapegoat, the Azazel goat was chased out, they would tie a red ribbon on the horn or neck. Miraculously, year after year, by a miracle, the red ribbon always turned white, signifying that God had forgiven Israel for their sins for that year. But the Jewish writings go on to state a date came when the red ribbon no longer turned white, and that was on the year AD 30. So from AD 30 to 87, there were 40 more days of atonement that continued the same ceremony for 40 more years. But the red ribbon never turned white again, showing God was no longer forgiving their sins by means of the 2 goats. What it says for us who are Jewish believers is this: the rabbis who recorded these legends failed to conclude why the red ribbon stopped turning white, because of Tetelestai, it is finished. In Hebrews 10:18 teaches, Once you have remission of sins, there's no more sacrifice for sins. So again, Jewish writers do not record the wrenching of the veil, but they do record something significant happened in connection with the temple as of the year AD 30. The two major results of this company signs. The first result is Luke 48, is a fear among the Jewish leaders as they observe these things happening. The second result in Matthew 27:54 is the belief that part of the Gentile Romans are Syrian. Now, the way the person that normally dies of crucifixion is ultimately by suffocation, because the way you hang in there, you can't breathe, and the reason they put the wooden ledge by the foot is so the victim could lift himself up, take a breath, and come down again. And in doing so, going up and down, he could survive for a few days. But keep in mind that the cross was now smooth, so after a while, going up and down will make your back rather sore. In the case of Jesus, the pain was immediate because of the scourge he suffered. One day to hasten the death process is simply to break the legs of the victim that can no longer lift themselves up, and they would suffocate. Shortly thereafter, they proceeded to break the legs of the other two, but Jesus had already dismissed the spirit from the body, and they do not break his legs, fulfilling the Passover motif of Exodus 12:46. No bones of his were broken. But to make sure his dead soldier pierced aside, when he pierced aside, out came the blood and water to fill another prophecy in Zechariah 12:10. They would look upon him whom they pierced. There's been some discussion of what that meant medically. As some doctors have written, this is a sign of a ruptured heart. They gave a nice devotion and he died of a broken heart. Other doctors have written disputed the conclusion. As to what this means medically, I have no idea. One main concern is, what does this mean theologically? What are you rap reading from? Jewish Life of the Messiah. These are the lecture notes. And noticing your harmony on John reports this particular event, he also mentioned was an eyewitness to the event. And then when they writes the book of 1 John, in 1 John 5:8-12, he makes the reference to the water, the blood. For him, it's the evidence that God could provide eternal life, because it did mark Messiah's death. And by death, he provides eternal life. And this is significant spiritually of the outpouring of the blood and the water. The 28 stages, the request for the body of Jesus. Look at Mark 15:42. And now when even was come, because it was the preparation, again with a capital P, and because he's writing to Romans, they might not know what the term means. He explains it. That is the day before the Sabbath. This is typical of Jewish terminology for the Friday-Saturday connection. The day of the preparation was Friday. Friday sundown, the Sabbath begins. At this point, two men come forward. One we met earlier is Nicodemus, who now comes out openly to identify with Jesus, and now we meet a new individual we have not heard of before, Joseph of Arimathea. We learned several things about him from the Gospels. Number one, he was of an honorable estate, which also means he came from a line of well-recognized, well-known people. Secondly, he was wealthy. That's how he could afford his own tomb near Jerusalem. Though that's not where he lived in Arimathea. Third, he was a good man that would emphasize his external actions. Fourthly, he was righteous. That was his internal state. Fifthly, he was one looking for the kingdom of God. He was a member of the remnant of the day. Sixthly, he was a counselor, meaning he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Seventh, but he was not yet a vote. And eighth, he was a secret disciple up until now. Up until now, he was a believer, but he kept quiet about it. And now, as John points out in John 19:38, they were quiet because of fear of the Jewish community. But now, in contrast to his previous fearfulness, the end of Mark 15:43, he boldly went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. He boldly requested for the body. And in Mark 15:44, Pilate sent somebody out to check to make sure that Jesus was dead. And then they verified he permits the body to be released. The 29 stages removal of the body from the cross to wrap the body in linen cloth. Now, if you look at John's account, the end of John 19:40, they bound him in cloth. Notice the word cloth means strips of cloth, not a shroud over his body as a whole, but strips of cloth. That's why the Jewish people buried bodies in the first century. This shows that whatever the shroud of Turin might be, it's not the shroud of Jesus, whatever it might be. So he's saying because the strips of cloth that the shroud of Turin don't count. Anyway. Now the 13th stage is the actual burial in John 19:41-42. He's buried in a new unused tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Luke 23:54 says, and it was the day of the preparation, the Sabbath drew on. As soon as the sundown occurs, 3 stars are visible, the Sabbath will begin. Now getting back to our passage of 1 Corinthians 15:1-4, the first point of the gospel is he died for our sins. The second point of the gospel is he was buried. I mentioned 2 theological significance of the burial for Jesus. First of all, it marks the last stage of his humiliation in 2 ways. First of all, it meant the death of the God-man. Being sinless, he should not have died. Yet he died the death like a sinner dies, because he died in our substitution. And secondly, none of those who were close to him participated in the burial. Notice that. None of those who were close to him in his life and ministry participated in the burial. He's buried by two men who were both Pharisees, who until now have become secret believers. Okay, I'm glad we're getting some newer people around here. Anyway, I'll interact more whenever I get through this. Now, theologians speak about the humiliation of the Son, in which they go from his incarnation and the likeness of sinful flesh into his burial. They also speak of the exaltation of the Messiah. They begin the exaltation normally with the resurrection, and they conclude with the enthronement at the right hand of God, the Father, 40 days later. I personally will begin the exaltation also with the burial. We said that in two ways. He's buried in a new, unused, rich man's tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Furthermore, in place of being buried in a common cemetery, he's buried in a privately owned garden. Now, centuries earlier, the first Adam in the Garden of Eden brought judgment and death. And now in this garden, the last Adam will bring blessing and new life to come. And again, the burial is part of the gospel because the evidence of his real death. So the first point is he died for our sins. Secondly, he was buried. The evidence of his real death. The third point, as we'll see later on, he rose on the third day according to scripture. The sealing of the tomb. Paragraph 168, the sealing of the tomb. The last two stages are found in the paragraph. Stage number 31, the paragraph for the embalmment, or the preparation for the embalmment. Now, the woman that came up with them from the Galilee took careful notice the exact tomb when they laid him. And in fact, Matthew points out that the two of the Mary sat against the sepulchre for a while. They didn't just get a look from the distance that could confuse the tombs. Two of them actually sat against the sepulchre for a while, and they began preparing ointments with the intent of finishing the embalming procedure. The burial customs was the Sabbath comes to an end. And the 32nd stage is the sealing of the tomb in Matthew's account in Matthew 27, 62 and 66. Now notice the elders of Israel do remember his statement about being raised from the dead. It's interesting because the apostles never got to the point, but the enemies did get the point. What they're afraid of now is that somebody would come and steal the body and would preach the resurrection and point out from their perspective at the end of Matthew 27, 64. The last era will be even worse than the first era. So Pilate does two things for them. First of all, he puts a Roman guard on the tomb to guard it for 3 days. Now keep in mind, under Roman law, if they failed to guard the tomb, if they fail to guard the body, they'll be facing the death penalty. That was the Roman law. But secondly, he had the tomb sealed with the Roman seal. Let's see how that was done. The caves were dug out in the hill country around Jerusalem, and Judah in the hill country was made mostly of limestone, and they were simply carved out a cave. In front of the cave, you would have grooves, and the purpose of the groove is for the stone to be rolled back and forth. These were family tombs. They could be rolled back and forth as necessary as different family members died. Now, to seal a tomb, they would tie ropes and crisscross the ropes or hooks against the wall of the tomb and the ground in at least 2 different places, sometimes more. In at least 2 different places, they would pluck the clay wax seal with the ropes crisscrossed. Also, where the stone touched the tomb, it was done in such a way it'd be impossible. Hey, Pete. Hey, David. To roll the stone away without breaking the Roman seal, and if they break the Roman seal, are punishable by death. So they try to make it very, very secure. The body cannot be removed, stolen, or whatever. I want to say a few more things about the day that he died because people have ignored the Jewish background, the Jewish reckoning, the time. To get him in the tomb 3 full 24-hour periods of summer moved his death to Thursday, more often to Wednesday, a few even to Tuesday, depending when they begin the 3-day countdown. Now keep in mind, if he was in the tomb for 3 full 24-hour periods and rose only 1 second day later, it's already the 4th day, not the 3rd day. Now Jesus actually made 3 different statements about the timing of his death and resurrection. 3 different statements. First of all, he said he would rise on the 3rd day. One example of several is Matthew 16:21. A second way he said is after 3 days, not on the 3rd day, but after 3 days, implying the 4th day. One example of several, Matthew 26:61, and a third statement he made is 3 days and 3 nights in Matthew 12:39 and 40. Notice I gave you all 3 versions from the same gospel because it's not a variation between the gospel writers. The same gospel writers used all 3 different methods. Now again, in Jewish reckoning, for example, part of a year counts for the whole year. If a king takes the throne on the 12th month of the year, he's viewed as having ruled the whole year. Then the very next month would read the 2nd year of his reign. How could it be the 2nd year when he reigned for 1 month? Because part of the year counts for the whole year. The same applies to a day. Part of the day counts for the whole day, or 24 hours of it, both the day and the night of it. So he was in the grave partly of Friday, which counts for all of Friday, and then Saturday, and then part of Sunday, which counts for all of Sunday. He did rise on the third day. Friday was the first day. Saturday was the second day. Sunday the third, because part of Sunday counts for all of Sunday. It's also true he rose after 3 days. 3 days and 3 nights was a Jewish idiom of speech, meaning any period of time that touches 3 days. Part of a day counts for the whole day, which includes the night and the day of it. In fact, it used away in several passages in the Old Testament that cannot in context mean 3 full 24-hour days. Let me give you some examples. Genesis 42, 1 Samuel 30, 1 Kings 20, 2 Chronicles 10. A few good one, by the way, is Esther 4:16 and 5:1. In chapter 4 passage, it says, fast for me 3 days and 3 nights. Was it? I already said that. Let's see, where is it? And I will go and see the king. So if you just take that by itself, there are fasts for 3 days and 3 nights. When it's all over on the 4th day, she will see the king. But chapter 5 verse 1 says, on the 3rd day, she went to see the king. You won't squeeze 324 periods from it. In Jewish reckoning of time, it's not necessary. One more point of evidence that comes from the Jewish Talmud, which does mention the death of Jesus and actually specifies twice what day of the week he died. I quote you as it reads, this is tradition on the eve of the Sabbath and on Passover. They hung Jesus. The heralds went out crying, Jesus go forth to be executed because he practiced sorcery and seduced Israel and estranged them from their God. Let anyone that could bring forward a justifying plea for him come and give information concerning him, but no justifying plea could be found for him. So they hung Jesus on the eve of the Sabbath and on the Passover. Twice it says on the eve of the Sabbath, that makes it Friday, and then the Passover. They have to justify it by saying he was seducing Israel because it was contrary to Jewish laws, and we saw to do executions on the festival. We'll see some more evidence when we can move into some of the resurrection scenes shortly. Yes, Pete, that's what I do. It speeds up my reading so that I'm not defeated. Whenever people giving me assignment, I do the best to confine myself into a confinement, and then hopefully I bring about a refinement so that I'll be thinking about things that are going to be on the quiz, because really I'm not a whiz, but you know what I can say? I'm not afraid of this. I'm not afraid to step up to the grade and do the type of study that is needed. And what can I say? That's how I'm proceeding. So hopefully when people think that I'm a weakling, they will see that I'm reading and it will sink in. It'll be like osmosis or psychosis, the way that I be spitting it, and so people will be getting it. Hopefully I won't be forgetting it, taking it to short term, bringing it to long memory. Can't you see that it's simmering? And hopefully you see what it is. It's like shimmering, shining like a diamond. Like I said, it's all for refinement. Anyway, the resurrection and the ascension of the king, the dawn and the resurrection day. Now we come to the 10th and the final segment of his life, the resurrection and ascension of the king. We talk about the theological significance of his death and burial. Let's begin with the theological significance of his resurrection. In paragraph 169, the dawning of the resurrection day, we characterize it in different categories. First of all, he's the Messiah that proved to be the Son of God. Romans 1:4 was the evidence that he was the Son of God. Second, they confirmed the truth of all that he said. Matthew 28:6, it also means the first fruits of the first resurrection. Keep in mind the Bible describes 2 different kinds of resurrections. The first kind is a restoration back to natural life. That means you die again later. And those people raised from the Old Testament are the people raised even by him before his own death and resurrection, but they were restored back to natural life. The second type of resurrection leads to resurrection life, where mortality puts on immortality, corruption puts on incorruption, and now immortal cannot die. He was the first one to be raised in let's see, in this kind of body. He's the first fruit of the first resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, it was a declaration of the Father that the Messiah met all the requirements of the law of Moses. Philippians 2:9. The second category, specific resurrection to people in general. He makes certain resurrection of all men. Both believers and unbelievers will be resurrected, though not for the same destiny. 1 Corinthians 15:20-33. It also guarantees the judgment of all unbelievers, and all believers will be judged on the basis of the resurrected Son. Acts 10, Acts 17. Thirdly, resurrection of the Old Testament saints is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promise of their salvation. It means the removal of their sins and guarantee of their future resurrection. Acts 13. The significance of believers specifically, it proves our justification. We're justified by his death. His resurrection proves our justification. Romans 4. Second, it guarantees power for believers' service, resurrection power to accomplish what we've been called to do, Ephesians 1. Third, it guarantees the believer's individual resurrection to immortality, Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 6, 2 Corinthians 4. Fourthly, it means the forgiveness of the believer's sins. We're forgiven because of his death. But again, this is the evidence of it. 1 Corinthians 15, the Messiah is the head of the church. Ephesians 1:20, it means the Messiah now has the keys of death as far as believers are concerned. So when a believer dies, it is Jesus that puts us to death, puts us to sleep. The one exception to the rule is a believer who has been excommunicated from the local assembly. When that happens, the Satan can put the believer to death only in the physical sense, not in the spiritual sense, but normal. It is Jesus who puts us to death. Hebrews 2, 9 and 18, 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 and 15. Even now there was a sympathetic high priest in the heaven as a result of the resurrection. Hebrews 4, 14 through 16. The dawning of a resurrected day. Now in paragraph 169, we have the visit of the womb to the tomb, of the women to the tomb, sorry. Women does relate to womb, so it's kind of interesting. Visit of the woman to the tomb. Matthew says in Matthew 28:1, now late on the Sabbath day, it began to dawn toward the first day of the week. In English, we use the word dawn to mean the wee hours of the morning as light begins to appear on the horizon before the sun appears. But in Greek and Hebrew, it simply means the beginning of a new day, without telling us what time of day it was. And keep in mind, in Jewish reckoning, where Matthew would be very conscious of, the first day of the week is not the wee hours of Sunday morning, but it begins sundown Saturday and will continue to sundown Sunday. So late on the Sabbath, late afternoon, towards early evening, they went to see and visit the tomb. The opening of the tomb. Now, paragraph 170, the opening of the tomb. It's now 17 in Nisan, April 9th, AD 30. And just as the earthquake marked the point of the death, notice the second earthquake marks the point of the resurrection. The second thing that happens, the angel comes down and rolls the stones away. And when the angel rolled the stone away, he broke the Roman seal. And because he broke the Roman seal, the soldiers stood up, proceeded to have the angel arrested. You don't go around arresting angels, especially in verse 3. His appearance was lightning, and his raiment is white as snow. So the thing that happened is they became his dead men. Would say in English, they were scared stiff. They were so afraid they couldn't move either forward or backward. Now, paragraph 171, the visit of the women. It's now in the wee hours of our Sunday morning, the woman coming to the tomb for the purpose of finishing the burial procedures. Remember, the very fact that made it all the burial procedure shows they're not anticipation of resurrection to occur. The first woman is a woman of one, a group of one, Mary Magdalene. In John's account, John 21. What we see is the stone rolled away in the tomb empty. She does not see any angels. She leaves the tomb area working on the assumption that someone had moved the body. And she's gone with the other woman came in, and they do see the angels, and they do get the message of the resurrection. The message is 2 points. First of all, Jesus himself is risen from the dead. So there's no reason to seek him among the dead. That's in Luke 24:5. But secondly, in Mark's account, Mark 16, 6 and 7, they go back to the disciples and tell them to leave for Galilee. Remember, during the last Passover, he told them when he was arrested, they had to proceed to Galilee and to meet with them when he rises from the dead in Galilee. Although he taught them at least 4 times, we have recorded the whole program of death and resurrection. We're always told they never comprehended what he was saying. So what caught them by surprise that they still hadn't left for the Galilee as they should have done on Friday. So now they receive a second command, leave for Galilee and meet them up with them in Galilee. At that point, 3 things happen. First of all, remember Luke 21:8, they remember his prophecy. They finally remember about the prophecy about being raised from the dead. Secondly, in Mark 16:8, they're told no one outside the apostolic group. But thirdly, in Matthew 28:8, they did run to tell the apostles, report of the apostles. When they take one more, we'll take one more before we break. Paragraph 172, the report to the apostles. Now Miriam run to 2 disciples, 2 apostles, Peter and John, telling them only about the enemy tomb. The other women tell the other 9 apostles the message that they got. But Luke points out in Luke 24:11, these words appeared in the sight as idle talk, and they disbelieved. The report they got from the other women is disbelieved. But Peter and John, who get the message a bit differently, only about an empty tomb, decided John 23-10 to run over and find out what the facts are. And John outruns Peter. We're told he stooped down. He didn't go inside. He looked inside. He saw 2 things. First of all, he saw the linen cloth still rolled up, which means the resurrection took place. Rather than the grave clothes. It wasn't necessary to unwrap them. It was the case of Lazarus, where Jesus said unwrap them. But these clothes were still wrapped up, which means he resurrected right through the grave clothes. And secondly, the head piece was over in a different part of the tomb, which again shows that whatever the shroud of Turin could be, it's not the shroud of Jesus. Let me get some water. I have the Star of David. So what that represents the nation. It's not even in the Old Testament. So you regretting it. You say it's the Star of Rephidim. What can I say is him for them? I'm not the one to put it on the book, but if you take a look, you will find out that it's from Dr. Fruitenbaum. And so don't get mad when you talk about a nation dropping bombs. If you come in with the anti-Semitism, you're going to be regretting because you ain't over there fighting with them. If you really about that stuff, then go over there and call their bluff. Join the Palestinians and let's see where they've been again. Until then, understand that I'm a dispensationalist, not a cessationalist, meaning I don't bank everything on 1948. But at the same time, I get the scripture straight. And I'm going to tell you, God has a future for the nation. You just wait. They're going to be resurrected in the tribulation, and forget what you insinuated. God's got a future. That wound is going to be sutured, and whether it's later or sooner, God's going to bring it. So don't be a doomer. I'm going to tell you the truth, and that's a fact that you got to accept, or you could reject it. Don't matter, because I said that God is the nation that he's going to protect. So that is the truth that I'm going to give you, and hopefully you will sit through. Anyway, sorry. Welcome, Edward. All right. Okay. I gotta shut my door real quick. My cat opened it. Right, John Smith. And then Peter, who's in the midst, a bit more impetuous, walks right into the tomb, and both see the same evidence, but they leave the tomb with the two different conclusions. John leaves the tomb area believing the resurrection is taking place, but Peter, when Luke 24:12, leaves the tomb area in a state of perplexity, not certain, but what he should do with what he just saw. We'll take a break, and then we'll finish up the account. Okay, so here's more of the note stuff. Well, we got to go slower through this. And I'm going to take it out of presentation mode. All right. And then we'll get up our marker. The second 3 hours, the wrath of God. Theological results of his death. So this is from 12 noon to 3 p.m. Satisfaction. This is the main thing. Full legal equivalent of the wrong done. So there's his definition for that. Full legal equivalent of the wrong done. The law has been satisfied for what it demanded concerning the wrong done. His death answered all the demands of God's law and justice against the sinner. It's kind of interesting. He doesn't say satisfaction for wrath. He just says what the law done. And so I'm going to just write the word wrath here to remind me why he didn't include wrath. Redemption. Okay, some of these slides are not. All right. Means that his death paid the price of the penalty of sin. Combining the 7 Greek words which are translated as redemption. In English Bibles, redemption emphasizes the believers have been set, purchased out of slave market of sin, and set free. The redemption of the believer occurs in 5 areas. So these are things I got to memorize. So 1, from the penalty of the law. That's easy. From the law itself. So this is the penalty of the law. So I got to put in my mind, okay, penalty would be like death, right? And then it says from the law itself. So this is like jurisdiction for Jewish believers. From the power of sin. Okay. And so we're talking about redeemed from the power of sin. Well, the power of sin is not the penalty. It's not the jurisdiction. The power of sin is what would manipulate the law. From the power of Satan. So there's one of our enemies, the flesh, Satan. A believer is no longer obligated to obey Satan. Fifthly, the believers are guaranteed future final redemption from all evil. All right, so this would be from the presence of sin. Guaranteed will occur with the resurrection of the body. So this kind of got going it. He's kind of going into a penalty, power, presence motif. The 3 P's: penalty of the law, power of sin, and the presence when you get a glorified body. Now he goes into propitiation. So it's interesting he has satisfaction separate from propitiation. I usually link those two together. Propitiation means God is satisfied with what the death of Messiah accomplished. It is a very basic meaning. Propitiation means to appease the wrath. There's the wrath idea of God. It does not mean his death merely satisfied a vengeful God, but it satisfied a God who's just, righteous, and holy. Then we got reconciliation. So basically, he's got satisfaction, redemption, propitiation, and reconciliation. Let's see if I got those right. Satisfaction, redemption, propitiation. Well, this is redemption also. And reconciliation. The position of the world was changed by his death so that all men are now able to be saved. So this is basically Charles Ryrie. He hasn't changed his view as far as atonement on this. His death rendered the whole world savable, yet salvation is only applied to those who believe. These are the passages support that. Ransom. It means that the blood of the Messiah was the price that had to be paid for the penalty of sin. So the ransom price. The blood and death of the Messiah is a ransom paid for the holy law of God. The proof of God's love for sinners. So now we're talking about the love of God. I'm just a lot to memorize, and it will all be on the quiz. You know, I always, whenever I talk about the death of Christ, I always talk about substitution, propitiation, reconciliation, redemption, and there was another one, I think, expiation sometimes, but he's got more than that here. It's rendered inoperative the reigning power of the sin nature's authority and power to reign over the believer. The sin nature is not removed when one believes, but is judged and condemned. The end of the law of Moses. 8. His death marked the end of the law of Moses. Believers are no longer under the law of Moses, but under a new law, the law of Messiah. The basis for continuous cleansing. It is the ground. So this is for the believer. It is the grounds of the basis for the believer's cleansing for sin. The basis for the removal of sin committed since one believed. It is family forgiveness based upon the blood. The basis for removal of pre-cross sins. Pre-cross sins, okay. He not only died for the sins to be committed from then on, but also for the sins of the world committed before the death. Animal blood was not sufficient to take away sins. Animal blood was able to cover sin, but not remove sin. That's a typical response. Only his death could accomplish the removal of the pre-cross sins. The judgment of Satan and his hosts. Number 11. It is the basis of the judgment of Satan and every fallen angel or demon of the great white throne judgment after the Messianic kingdom. The basis is the blood of Christ. The basis of deferred righteous divine judgment. God has every right to judge man immediately, but judgment is being delayed. It is being deferred because of his death. 13. The purification of things in the heavens. The blood of Jesus was used to cleanse the heavenly sanctuary, which has been defiled by Satan's fall. 14. The grounds for peace. It is the grounds for peace between God and man. It is the grounds for peace between Jews and Gentiles. It is the grounds for peace in the universe. 15. The basis for the national salvation of Israel. Someday all Israel will believe on him. Deuteronomy 30, Jeremiah 31, Romans 11. 16. The basis for establishment of the Messianic kingdom. Revelation 5, 8 through 14 make the point that the millennial kingdom cannot be established apart from the death of the Messiah. So then you go into the accompanying signs and the burial of the Messiah. It said the last stage of the Messiah's humiliation. It meant the death of the God-man, sinless one dying, the death of the sinner. None of those who were close to him during his life ministry were involved in his burial. The first stage of exaltation of the Messiah. So this is Fruitenbaum's unique view. He was buried in a new tomb and he was buried in a nice garden. I think that's what he said. But in a private garden, yeah. The burial is part of the gospel. He says 1 Corinthians 15:1-4 tells us that the gospel contains 3 points. He died for our sins, he was buried, and he rose on the third day. All these points are according to the scriptures. Then the sealing of the tomb and the resurrection, ascension of the king. So here's an image of what he was talking about concerning the tomb. There's the hooks, and then the seals would be here and here, and there's the groove that it would slide. Okay, and this is essentially what we've gone over. And we'll just go ahead over for the structure. The company signs the burial of the Messiah, the sealing of the tomb, the death of the king, the resurrection, ascension of the king, the dawning of the resurrection day, the opening of the tomb, the visit of the woman, the reports to the apostles, the first appearance Mary Magdalene, the second appearance to women, the report of the guard, the rejection of the second son of Jonah, the third appearance to 2 of the Emmaus Road, the fourth appearance Peter, the fifth appearance to 10, the sixth appearance to 11, the seventh appearance to 7, the eighth appearance to 500, the ninth appearance James, the 10th appearance to 11, the ascension of the king. And then the next part we're going to the sequel, which I'll cover. I think it's going to be on the next test, so I'll leave that part out. Let me see if there's anything else. So it's a lot to remember off this particular test, and what I typically do is I look for lists. And so like right here, I'm looking for numbers. Like it says 3 stages. The religious trial has 3 stages. All right. And we completed the second stage of the trial. Now, while the second stage is going on, elsewhere, we have the event of the denial by Peter. Okay. So this is talking about whenever, about the rooster, the 2 options. It's an actual rooster versus a watch, basically. The cursing, the oath language. He denied Jesus 3 different times. All right. So right here, look at this, guys. What you have here is the 3rd physical mistreatment, the first of 8 mockeries, and we'll suffer 4 mockeries before the cross and suffer 4 mockeries after the cross. So right here, this would be a good slide. Which one am I on? So it says the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th stages, there are 4 mockeries by 4 different groups. Common element within each one of them. Mock the specific claims, prove his messiahship. Yeah, okay. The 15th stage, conversion. Conversion. 15. 16. Today you will be with me in paradise. I got room for one more on this slide. 17. Third statement on the cross. Let's see. This is just describing all the women, but I think this is where he says, "Son, behold." Yeah, woman, behold your son. And I'm going to duplicate this, erase these. The different sources for the thick darkness: Dionysus, Diogenes, and then Phlegon. 20th stage. Well, you sure skipped some. I think one of them is the darkness. 17. I'll just put 18, 19, 20th. See if I see any more. It has to be the darkness. But it doesn't make sense how it jumped all the way to 20. My God, why are you forsaking me? Unless it's recognizing woman behold your son and son behold your mother is separate. 21. Now the 18th stage was darkness. 19th was this cry. You tripping. Somewhere you're tripping. Miscounted or something. Cry. So if the cry is this, and it can't be the 20th. I thirst. 21st is saying I thirst. But then he jumps back to 21st. Whatever. Well, I can't be expected to memorize something that doesn't even follow its own order. Look at that. It jumps all the way. Okay, now here's 22nd stage. Partakes of vinegar. That's so he can speak. Vinegar. G. Can't even spell vinegar right. What's up with that? V-I-N. Oh, here we go. 23. Okay. So this is talking about satisfaction, redemption, the things we've been redeemed from, propitiation, reconciliation, fifth result, ransom. I'll have to study those. Where's the rest of the stages? I think he lost count. falls for the first time, meets his mother. There's some things like this stuff's not in the biblical account, so I could see why Fruitbaum changed it to stages rather than stations. Well, I got through the reading. I got to do some more studying. I'm gonna look at the comments here. Looks like y'all are having a blast in the chats. They're talking about the book of life. What's going on? What do you write? Whole article? Yes. Pendant was like 1800 years old. Feels like I never be a rapper. Well, praise the divine Messiah. All right. Well, this is even worse, Edward. You say you have to star David for some stupid reason, but he's not even in the Old Testament. Who's not even in the Old Testament? You mean the star? The star of Israel, yeah. From Balaam's prophecy. Esau was a fool for selling his birthright for a meal, yeah. He said, there's nothing no one said that made me angry. Okay. Go for the sin no more. Thanks for the likes. It's the lies that need to be checked. Yeah, that's why you should set up a formal debate. Why would you be willing to say you're God's chosen people knowing you're not? This is insane. I don't think I'm Israel. What are you talking about? Real Israelites or Jews don't have to convert religion, plus Judaism. They're soon formed a religion called Judaism. You people. Semitism stuff. Truth has to be shown. Shout out. Good morning. Yes, policy against certain names. I wonder about the Batang name. I will erase. Not my channel. Moderate for that. Batang Negros TV. Let me see something about that. That's not a so Big Stack, that's not an N-word. That's the actual place in the Philippines. So it's fine. Don't worry about it. But he's fine. That's a location in the Philippines. So William Mars talking about some of the, background stuff. All right, guys. I got accomplished what I needed to read. I'll go over it and study it and take a quiz soon. But y'all check out more content, old stuff and new stuff. God bless.